Faith. When I was working at A University Bookshop opposite to Manchester University, a fairly regular customer was the Professor of Comparative Religion. A very, very nice man, actually, and we would have inconsequential chat and occasionally touch upon things that interested him and me, such as the Golden Bough, which I'd been reading, which he cast some doubt upon the findings and this particular work. He was also an ordained minister of the church, particularly what particular branch of the church, I don't know, whether it was high church, low church, no idea. I suspect perhaps it would have probably been fairly high church, high Anglican. I might be completely wrong. There was always a question I wanted to ask him, but you know, I was 22 years old at the time and was not very self-confident and nervous. He might have actually been responding quite well. He might have actually welcomed the question. Excuse me. The question was this, really. I found it difficult to understand why a professor of comparative religion, who would know all about the mechanisms of syncretism, the history of the church, theology, other religions, excuse me, and in fact, an expert on religion, comparative religion, could in fact retain his faith. This might have not been a sensible question, I don't know, but it was one which I found somewhat intriguing because I found it difficult to understand how somebody with that breadth of knowledge could actually retain their faith. For instance, just to give you an example, when George Eliot in the 19th century was involved in the translations of German critical appraisal of the Bible, in fact, basically it undermined her faith completely. I mean, she'd been a very ardent an ardent evangelical, and though she retained a great respect and belief in the kind of moral teachings of Christianity, she lost her faith, and because of this critical appraisal of the Bible, which was carried out by German scholars. It's always been a bit of a fantasy of mine to drop in at some church at random and hope to have a bit of a conversation with the incumbent there and ask him this question and explain my reasons for asking it, and say, basically, obviously you are an ordained minister of the church, and obviously have belief in the tenets and the theology and the practice of the church, but people who become ordained ministers, in fact, are people of intelligence, not always, but are intelligent, sometimes highly intelligent, and you know about theology, you know about the criticism of it, you know about the history of religion, and we're talking about Christianity. I mean, the whole history of the influence of Christianity on certainly on the European world, and its eventual spreading throughout the world, not always with good consequences. I find it very difficult sometimes to really read the history of such things and the kind of horrors that were inflicted on people, and the way totally unsuitable ways of thinking and living were actually forced upon indigenous people. But this is, it's not really, it's a game that you can't really win, this measuring the good against the bad. But I really would have been interested, if I had this fantasy conversation, to know how they managed to retain their faith. I was never what you call a believer, I don't believe. When I was a child, the first thing I saw when I arrived at my primary school as a small child was the light of the world, the famous painting on the wall, and remember singing All Things Bright and Beautiful. Obviously, it was a church school. Religion was not forced down our throats, but it was there. It was there. And also, as I got older, of course, there was a lot of the social life at that time, certainly for me and my acquaintances, was around the church, in fact, with the Boy Scouts, the youth club, and similar activities. Some people were bandsmen, and it was an important part of our lives. I was sent to Sunday school from a very early age, went dutifully every Sunday, and in fact, if I'm to be honest, became to some extent a bit of a self-righteous prig. But in church as a choir boy, I never really was affected very much by the service as such. The one thing I did love at that time was the music, though not particularly the English hymnal. I found the English hymnal and the musical settings rather maudlin. The things I liked best was when the organist actually played settings of things such as Nick Dimitas or the Magnificat, which was sometimes extremely beautiful. I remember discussing with my contemporaries occasionally matters of religion, but I was never very satisfied with these particular discourses. I remember mentioning some particular thing and saying to a friend who actually came from quite a religious family about what happened at this particular point in history and how could it be dealt with, and his reply was God had a way, which I found totally unconvincing. I have to admit, of course, that in terms of artistic, architectural and musical spheres, the church, in fact, over the centuries has produced amazing things. I have a kind of affection for little country churches. Cathedrals I find impressive, but I always find the interiors very impressive, not impressive, oppressive, and rather gloomy. And I look at people, in fact, who became ardent Christians, particularly literary people like T.S. Eliot, for instance, and similar individuals who really embraced it. But I can also see that from their point of view, there might have been an aesthetic dimension to this, the ritual, the vestments, and of course with the certain branches of the church, of course, the Catholic Church, and perhaps even high Anglicanism, excuse me. The Latin would be used, which added to an air of mystery. And I can quite understand why some people, in fact, really objected to the Latin not being used anymore and the vernacular taking its place. I love the kind of church music such as Gregorian chant, choirs from the Russian Orthodox Church, this kind of church music, plain song. I think it's wonderful, but I don't get a dimension of faith out of this. It's an aesthetic appreciation. And this is the question, really. Most of the people I know who seem to be religious came from fairly religious families. One or two of my acquaintances were kind of very influenced by the Billy Graham, as he cuts a swathe through the UK with his mammoth meetings, and became very ardent Christians indeed. And I remember in one particular guy, I'd be about 14, 15, the Sunday school teacher actually allowed one of these individuals to address us. And he had this sense of rather contrived piety, and went on about, no more dancing and etc. in the same theme. And I remember thinking to myself, this is absolute nonsense. This guy probably never danced much. I don't probably think he'd ever even kissed a girl. So it all seemed rather faux to me, quite frankly. Having got to this point, where do I stand? Well, I do actually describe myself as agnostic, which in fact is quite an abused term. People think it's sitting on the fence. I don't think so. I don't think so. It falls between believers and the atheists. And atheism, in my estimation at least, is in its way a faith-driven belief. Because it can never be proved. They can never prove their case in quite the same way as religions cannot really prove what they're believing. They believe it, they have faith in it, but they can't really prove it. And this actually is exactly the same with the people who are atheists. And also, the world, from my point of view, is a world where our perception is limited. Bergson, the French philosopher, said, "The brain is an organ of limitation that restricts man's consciousness to what is practically useful." And this is something I believe. I really do. There's a dimension to the mystery of the universe and mystery of life which is unknowable, and I have no optimism that it will be ever known. So my agnosticism is actually based upon this. Ultimately, though, when we're talking about these great mysteries, I do actually believe Schopenhauer's tenets that music was the great solace, and from my point of view, music certainly, if not religion, has been central to my life and has made each day worth living.
If you've enjoyed this video and would like to see more, please subscribe.